This story is very meaningful. Everyone should hear it. Listen to Brian tell the story. I'm David, 34 years old, and sitting alone in the dark of my apartment, staring at the ring that was once my wife's. I can't believe how far things have fallen. I thought our marriage was solid, but nothing could have prepared me for the day Julia dropped the bombshell. It all started when I met Julia years ago. I was a small-town guy, working odd jobs, living a modest life. I had no illusions about my future, just taking it one day at a time. Then I met Julia. She was beautiful, smart, and came from money. She was everything I wasn't. But for some reason, I managed to win her heart. The first few years were blissful. We got married after a whirlwind romance, but I should have seen the warning signs. Her family, they never truly accepted me. Her father, Phil, was a force to be reckoned with. A man who thought the world revolved around him and his money. I felt that pressure the moment I stepped into their lavish home for the first time. He didn't even bother to hide his disdain for me, making every conversation feel like a battle for approval. And my mother-in-law, Myra, she wasn't much better. Behind her smile, there was a sharp edge, a calculated presence that left me uneasy. When we got engaged, they insisted I sign a prenuptial agreement. I was caught off guard. I loved Julia, and at the time, I thought this was just something rich families did. The agreement stated that any inheritance or windfall Julia received would remain her property. I didn't think it would matter. After all, I had nothing to contribute in their eyes. But when Julia won that $9 million lottery, everything changed. At first, I was thrilled. We could leave the grind behind, travel, live freely. But Julia became distant, almost paranoid. She kept the news from everyone, even from my parents, as if she feared they would take a piece of the fortune. When I asked about the plans, she kept pushing me away, telling me I was out of my depth. Then, one afternoon, it happened. I walked into our condo, tired from a long day at work, and found Julia packing. I was confused at first, thinking it was just some sort of misunderstanding. But then she told me the words I never saw coming. I'm filing for divorce. You need to leave. The condo, the life we'd built together. Suddenly, it was all hers. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. I tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen. It wasn't just the money. It was the way she looked at me, as if I was now disposable. I called my father, my voice shaking with disbelief, and he told me to stay calm, to wait, that it would all play out. But the worst was yet to come. I soon learned that Julia's parents were not just involved. They were the ones pulling the strings. They had sent their personal attorney to ensure that I got nothing. That's when I realized the prenup wasn't just a formality. They had planned this all along. They were trying to ensure that I had no claim to the lottery money. I was furious, hurt, and felt like a fool. But I wasn't going to let them take everything from me. I went to a family lawyer, and that's when I found out the prenup had a loophole. Despite the way they'd tried to control me, the agreement stated that any big windfall we received during the marriage, like lottery winnings, would be considered marital property. That was the lifeline I needed. With the lawyer's help, I fought back. The emotional toll was exhausting. Every call from Julia's family, every accusation from her lawyer made me question everything. But I didn't back down. I fought for my share, for the life I had worked so hard for. As the court date approached, things got even more intense. Julia avoided all direct communication with me, hiding behind her lawyers, while her father, Phil, used every dirty trick in the book to intimidate me. They spread rumors, painted me as a gold digger, and even tried to interfere with my job. But nothing stopped me. The court hearings were long and grueling. Julia's side tried to argue that the lottery winnings were a personal gain, but my lawyer pointed out that the prenup was clear. It included such windfalls. The judge seemed unmoved by their attempts to dismiss the case. Every time they tried to undermine me, we came back stronger, with clear evidence showing my contributions to the marriage. The tension was unbearable. I could see the cracks in Julia's facade, the guilt in her eyes as she listened to the testimony. She was caught between her love for her family and the reality that they had manipulated her. The final court hearing was like nothing I had ever experienced. The judge ruled in my favor, stating that the lottery winnings were to be divided between us, just as the prenup had stipulated. I was entitled to my share of the money, as well as compensation for my contributions to the condo. When the judge made the final ruling, it felt like a wave crashing over me. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. They had tried to strip me of everything, but in the end, I was vindicated. The aftermath was a mixture of relief and sadness. I received a check for a significant amount, but it wasn't a victory that felt sweet. Julia, my wife, had lost everything: her marriage, her dignity, her family's respect. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to feel any sympathy for her. She had chosen this path. As for my in-laws, their power had crumbled. They could no longer control me, no longer manipulate me. But the price was steep. They had lost a son-in-law, a man who had once loved their daughter, a man who had stood by her when things weren't easy. And now, they were left with nothing but their wealth, their pride, and a family fractured by their greed. After the ruling, things didn't just fall back into place. I had won, yes, but it felt like the beginning of a long, painful road ahead. The money, while a welcome cushion, wasn't enough to erase the betrayal, the coldness that had surrounded me for months. The house was gone. The life we had built together shattered, and even though I had legal victory, I still felt hollow. I moved into a small apartment, the kind that feels temporary. It was a one-bedroom, just enough space for me to breathe again. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first few days, I didn't leave. I just sat there, staring at the walls, trying to wrap my mind around everything. The sense of betrayal, of being discarded like a piece of trash by the woman I had once loved, was suffocating. But as the days went by, I started to pull myself together. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the house or the lifestyle I had been forced to leave behind. It was about reclaiming my life, my sense of self-worth. I took long walks. I met with old friends who I hadn't spoken to in ages. It felt like I was reintroducing myself to the world. I even began going back to the gym, not because I wanted to look a certain way, but because I needed to feel strong again, physically and mentally. In the midst of all this, I received messages from Julia. At first, they were apologies, small, weak attempts at taking back the words she had said, the choices she had made. But I could tell they weren't sincere. They were coming from a place of guilt, not remorse. She tried to explain that her parents had manipulated her, that they had forced her into the divorce and the decisions that followed. But I wasn't buying it. I had been manipulated too long, and I had learned my lesson. The texts piled up, each one more desperate than the last. I finally blocked her number. The last thing I needed was a reminder of the woman who had kicked me out of my own home, who had betrayed me for money. Then came the phone call from my mother-in-law, the one I had been expecting, but not quite prepared for. She was calm at first, almost too calm. She asked if we could talk, that they had made a huge mistake, and that they were sorry. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I wasn't interested in talking to her, that there was nothing left to say. She persisted, telling me that she didn't want this rift between us. But I could hear the desperation in her voice. It wasn't genuine concern for me or my well-being. It was the realization that they were losing control. I let her speak for a few minutes before I interrupted. "I'm not the one who destroyed our family," I said. "You all did. You manipulated me. You used me. And now, you want to play the victim? You made your bed. I'm done with all of you." There was silence on the other end. It was the first time in months I had spoken so decisively, and for a moment I felt a strange sense of peace. I had said what needed to be said, and for once, it wasn't about playing nice or worrying about their feelings. I didn't hear from them for weeks after that, but I knew they were still trying to figure out how to spin everything in their favor. I didn't care. The months that followed were a whirlwind of personal growth. I immersed myself in work, making decisions that were solely for my benefit. I started making plans for my future. Not a future that was built on someone else's wealth, but one that was mine, from the ground up. I met new people, including Jane, a woman I had crossed paths with several times at the gym. She was different, strong, independent, and utterly unafraid to speak her mind. We started talking more, and before I knew it, we were spending weekends together, enjoying simple things like hikes and dinners. She didn't know about my past, not right away. I didn't want to carry the weight of it into a new relationship. But eventually, I told her everything. And surprisingly, she understood. The most surprising thing wasn't how accepting she was, though. It was that, for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel defined by the mistakes of my past. I wasn't the guy who had been swindled by his in-laws, or the guy who had been cast aside by a woman he loved. I was David, the man who had clawed his way back, the man who was starting over. As for Julia, she eventually remarried, or at least that's what I heard through mutual acquaintances. Her family still kept their distance, still played their games. But none of that mattered anymore. I had walked away from the mess they had created, and I wasn't looking back. And then, on a warm Saturday afternoon, just as I was sitting on the porch with Jane, enjoying a quiet moment, I got a call from my lawyer. "They've decided to settle," he said, his voice steady. "You'll get your portion of the lottery winnings, along with the compensation for the condo. They're offering you a final settlement." I paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. The entire battle, the months of stress, the constant legal wrangling, it was finally over. They had tried to take everything from me, and now they were forced to give it up. But as I sat there, I realized something. The money, while it would certainly help me rebuild my life, it didn't define me. I had already rebuilt. "I don't want to settle for less," I told my lawyer. "I want the full amount." The lawyer agreed. A few weeks later, after all the paperwork was finalized, I received the final check. It wasn't just a financial win, it was a personal victory. A moment of closure, but also a new beginning. As for my in-laws, they didn't reach out again. The phone calls stopped. The attempts to guilt-trip me ceased. I heard through the grapevine that they were still trying to salvage what they could, but they had lost the battle. I didn't need their money. I didn't need their approval. I had everything I needed now, my dignity, my peace, and a future that was entirely my own. It was the greatest lesson I'd learned. Sometimes the hardest battles lead to the strongest victories. And in the end, it wasn't about the money. It was about standing up for yourself when the world is trying to push you down. As I sat back, looking at Jane with a smile, I knew that the future was mine to shape. It was the night after the final hearing when I found myself sitting alone in the quiet of my apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. The fight for what was rightfully mine had been brutal, but it had also been liberating. I had fought, not just for the money, but for my dignity, for the respect I had been denied for so long. As I sat there, I thought about my former in-laws, Phil, Mael, and even Julia, the way they had tried to control everything in my life, how they thought their money and influence could buy them power over me. They thought they could manipulate me, discard me once I no longer served their purpose. But they were wrong. I had fought back. I had won. And now they were left with the consequences of their actions. It wasn't easy to feel sorry for them. They had shown me nothing but disrespect, had forced me into signing that prenup, had kicked me out when they thought I was no longer of value. They tried to ruin my life because they were too afraid of losing control. And yet, here I was, stronger than ever, standing on my own 2 feet. It was almost poetic, how their own greed had led to their downfall. Phil and Mael, once so confident in their manipulation, were now scrambling to salvage what little they could. They had tried to bully me into giving up my rightful share of the lottery winnings, but now they were the ones scrambling for answers. I had stood firm in the face of their intimidation, and it had cost them. I didn't need the money, not really. It wasn't about the jackpot. It was about reclaiming my life. I had nothing left to prove to them. Julia, on the other hand, was a different story. The woman I had once loved was now a distant memory. She had betrayed me in the worst way possible, choosing money and her family's influence over everything we had built together. I had hoped, for a moment, that she would stand by me, but she had sided with her parents. She was caught up in the idea that their wealth gave them the right to dictate everything. But in the end, she was just another casualty of her family's toxic influence. She had lost me, and in the process, she had lost herself. I still didn't know if she truly regretted what had happened. I didn't know if she was sorry for the way she treated me. But I didn't need to know. The closure wasn't for her. It was for me. As I thought about it all, I realized that this chapter of my life had come to an end. I had won the battle, but it wasn't just the legal victory that mattered. It was the emotional freedom, the strength I had found within myself. The money? That would be nice. But it wasn't the true prize. The real reward was that I had finally let go of the toxic grip my in-laws had on me. I had finally stepped into a life where I could breathe, where I could live without constantly looking over my shoulder. The life I was starting to build for myself was different. I had people who cared for me, people who had stood by me when I needed them the most. It was a far cry from the manipulation and control I had once known. I had learned so much about trust, about standing up for myself, about not letting anyone, not even family, dictate my worth. But as for my in-laws and Julia, their journey was just beginning. They were left to deal with the aftermath of their choices. They would have to live with the knowledge that they had pushed me to the brink, that their manipulation had led to their downfall. And me? I was moving forward, building something real, something that wasn't tainted by greed or lies. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the freedom to live my life on my terms. It was about finding peace, something I hadn't known for a long time. So as I sat there, looking out at the city lights, I realized that I was free. Not just free from my in-laws' control, but free from the bitterness, free from the resentment. I was starting over, and for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to what was next. And if there's one lesson I've learned, it's this: don't let anyone, no matter who they are, tell you what you're worth. Your worth isn't defined by money, by status, or by anyone else's approval. It's something you define for yourself. And when you stand firm, when you fight for what's rightfully yours, the world will take notice. Thank you for watching. If you've been through something similar, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more real-life stories like this. Remember, no one can take away your worth unless you let them. Keep fighting.